It was a Saturday morning when the smell hit first, thick black and ancient, the kind of rot that only surfaces when water disappears somewhere it was never supposed to leave. Judith Carver stood at the edge of what used to be a pristine shoreline, her heels sinking into dark mud with a sound like something swallowing. Behind her, 14 luxury boats listed sideways in the muck, their white fiberglass hulls streaked with silt. No waves, no water, just the slow, wet sound of expensive things settling into the earth. I stood on the hill above it all, coffee in hand, face unreadable. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching this from? Because this story starts with a single inheritance document. And it ends right here. My grandfather, Harold Parker, was not a man who wasted words, and he was not a man who wasted paper. When he passed away at 91 in the early spring of last year, he left behind two things of genuine consequence: a 4.2-acre lake in the middle of Pinewood Heights, Tennessee, and a foreign binder locked inside a fireproof safe. The deed to Lake Callaway had carried the Parker name since 1961, when Harold dammed a small tributary of Callaway Creek on his own land, filled the basin over 2 seasons, and watched the water settle into something permanent. The community that eventually grew up around it, the subdivision, the HOA, the manicured lawns and matching mailboxes came later. The lake came first. It was never theirs. It was never going to be. I am Gregory Allen Parker, 38 years old, licensed hydraulic engineer with the State Water Resources Division, and I had known about the lake my entire life. The way you know about something sacred, you don't talk about it much. You just understand its weight. When the deed was transferred into my name in March, along with the binder, I sat at Harold's kitchen table for a long time before I opened the clasp. Inside were survey maps, a water extraction permit renewed every 5 years, an old agreement with the county, and a handwritten letter in my grandfather's deliberate, slightly formal cursive. The last line read, "You'll know when it's time to use this." I set the letter aside and flipped to a document near the back: water rights, permit WR 1,987,044 issued by the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, granting the owner of record full authority over the lake's intake flow. I read it once, then closed the binder. I made a note in my head and moved on. I did not think I would need it soon. The envelope appeared on a Tuesday in April, tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck like a parking citation. The return address was the HOA Pinewood Heights Homeowners Association, and the logo was printed in a shade of navy blue that communicated institutional confidence. Inside was a notice titled Community Development Project Number 7, Pinewood Marina Construction Initiative. The document informed me in polite bureaucratic language that the HOA board had voted 9 to 111 in favor of a $1.2 million marina project along the northeast shoreline of Lake Callaway. A construction contract had already been signed with Harmon & Sons. The project had already been budgeted. The bulldozers were already scheduled. And at the bottom, in a flowing signature that managed to look both elegant and aggressive, was the name Judith M. Carver, President, Pinewood Heights HOA. I noticed the attached site plan showed 14 concrete pilings to be driven into the lake bed at an average depth of 2.1 m directly inside the buffer zone, designated in permit WR 987-44 as off-limits to any permanent structure. I read that detail twice, set the envelope on the kitchen counter, and poured myself another cup of coffee. Judith Carver had been president of the Pinewood Heights HOA for 7 consecutive years, a tenure maintained through careful information management and a talent for making dissent feel impolite. She was 54, sharp-dressed in a way that was meant to signal authority, and married to Dave Carver, a real estate attorney whose firm letterhead she deployed the way other people deploy weather warnings. Her motivations in this project were not hard to identify. She owned the longest, most expensive boat in the neighborhood, a 38-FT white-hulled vessel she kept trailered in her driveway because there was nowhere to put it in the water. The marina was built around her ambition, the way the notice was built around her signature. She showed up at my door that same afternoon, flanked by 2 board members who stood slightly behind her the way props stand behind a speaker. She wore a blazer and a smile calibrated precisely for conditional generosity. "Greg, this project will lift property values for everyone in the community, including you," she said. I looked at her and said 3 words. "I haven't signed anything." She smiled past me into the house. You don't need to sign anything. This is a community decision, I said. Thank you for stopping by, and closed the door. That evening, I did not post anything. I did not call anyone. I opened my laptop, pulled up the Tennessee Code annotated, and navigated to Section 693, the Water Resources Management Act. Then I opened the binder, placed the permit on top, took a blank sheet of paper, and began listing violations in bullet points, short, accurate, unemotional. This was the same work I did every week at the office. It required the same skills, observation, documentation, patience. By the time I went to bed, I had 6 items on the list. On Monday morning, I watched the first excavator swing its bucket into the northeast shoreline at 7:42. I photographed it, logged the timestamp, and saved it into a folder I had already created and named. HOA, Pinewood Heights Violation Record. Then I put on my work clothes and drove to the office. The second envelope arrived 10 days later by certified mail. This one bearing the official seal of the Pinewood Heights HOA, and a reference number I had never seen before. Inside was a formal notice of violation, specifically Regulation 14B concerning fences and lakefront structures, citing a split-rail fence that Harold Parker had installed along the shore in 1978, and that had stood there quietly and harmlessly for nearly half a century. The notice informed me that I was in violation of community standards, and that failure to remove the fence within 10 days would result in a fine of $350 per day until I complied. I sat with it for a moment, then pulled out the HOA's own governing documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions originally signed in 2002, and read the definition of property subject to HOA jurisdiction. Lake Callaway and its shoreline did not appear in that definition. They never had. I highlighted the relevant passage with a yellow marker, photographed the page, and added it to the folder. Judith escalated the following week in a direction I had anticipated the community meeting. 60 residents packed the neighborhood clubhouse on a Thursday evening, and she opened with a polished presentation full of architects' renderings and soft blue watercolor graphics showing sailboats gliding serenely at the new Marina. The word vision appeared 4 times. The phrase community investment appeared 7. What she never once said was that the lake did not belong to the HOA, that no easement had been recorded, and that the northeast shoreline where the pilings were being driven was legally and geographically private property, belonging to one Gregory Allen Parker. Her husband Dave sat in the front row with his arms crossed, nodding at the moments calibrated to receive nods. When she announced that Harmon & Sons had already begun pouring concrete, several people applauded. A neighbor of mine named Marcus found me in my driveway the next morning, genuinely concerned. "Man, you should just sign whatever they want," he told me. "You don't want the whole neighborhood turning on you." I handed him a cup of coffee I'd already poured. "I'm reviewing my options," I said. He meant well. He just didn't know what was in the binder. The third envelope came on a Saturday, and this one had a law firm letterhead, Carver and Associates, which was in fact Dave Carver's own practice. The letter demanded that I cease all interference with community development activities and warned of civil litigation for tortious interference if the project suffered any delay attributable to my actions. It cited a provision from Tennessee commercial law that applies to business-to-business disputes, not to private property ownership conflicts. It got the date of the original permit wrong by 2 years. And critically, it bore no court filing stamp, no docket number, and no signature from anyone other than Dave himself. It was a letter designed to look like legal authority. I read it twice, underlined 3 specific errors, scanned the document, and saved it as Carver Legal Threat 1. I did not respond. There was nothing to respond to. By the second Saturday after the meeting, the pilings were going in. 14 concrete columns, positioned exactly where the site plan had shown, driven through the silt and into the bedrock of the lake bed inside the buffer zone. I stood on my side of the fence with my phone, recording video with GPS and timestamp running. The coordinates matched. I had everything I needed to confirm the violation I had already documented in writing. While I filmed, I was also thinking about a different document, a 2-page appendix at the back of Permit WR 1987044, Section 7.3, which granted the permit holder the right to reduce intake flow through control valve CV03 for routine maintenance purposes without prior notice to any outside party. It was a standard clause. It was entirely within my rights, and the Marina's structural drawings showed a minimum operating depth of 1.8 m, a number that became meaningful when you understood what happened to lake levels during a controlled intake reduction of 60 to 70% over 36 hours. I did not do anything about that yet. I opened the map on my tablet, zoomed in on the upstream pump station Harold had built in the 1980s, and looked at the small notation in the corner, CV03 Intake Control, Upstream Tributary. I zoomed out, gently pressed the home button, went inside. On the community page online, Judith posted a photograph of herself, standing beside the first completed piling, wearing a hard hat over her styled hair, and holding a small Pinewood Heights flag. The caption read, "Our dream is taking shape. Thank you to everyone who believed." 203 people responded positively. Some in the comments typed a single question, "Who actually owns the lake?" And it was deleted within 4 minutes. I did not see who deleted it. I did not need to. Hold on. Let me make sure you're catching what just happened. This man inherited a private lake complete with a 60-year-old permit that gives him direct legal control over the water level, and the HOA built a marina on it without his permission, without an easement, without anything. Then they sent him fake fines, a letter from the president's own husband pretending to be independent legal counsel, and deleted the one comment asking, "Who actually owns the lake?" And Greg, he just kept adding files to a folder. He's not angry. He's organized. And that control valve, he hasn't touched it yet. Comment right now. What do you think is coming? Because the Marina's grand opening is already on the calendar. Monday came, and I was at my desk before 7. My colleagues at the State Water Resources Division knew me as the quiet one who brought spreadsheets to meetings and never raised his voice at contractors. I used no confidential information, accessed no restricted files, and contacted no one I didn't have a legitimate professional relationship with. Everything I needed was in the public database, the same portal any citizen in Tennessee can access with a browser and a case number. I pulled the official hydrographic survey of Lake Callaway and confirmed what Harold's paperwork had always stated. The lake was classified as a private water impoundment, created and maintained by the permit holder with no public easement, no municipal ownership, and no HOA jurisdiction ever in any recorded document. I printed the classification sheet, hole-punched it, and added it to the binder. The same morning, I called Patricia Owe, a water resources attorney who had spent 12 years at the state attorney general's office before entering private practice. We had met at a conference the previous year, and I had remembered her for 2 reasons. She asked the sharpest questions in the room, and she was not impressed by anything. I sent her the folder digitally before our call, all 41 files at that point, organized by category and dated in sequence. She called me back within an hour. They built inside the buffer zone, she said. It wasn't a question. 14 of the pilings, I confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. 3 independent violations. Unauthorized construction in a protected buffer, trespass on private land without a recorded easement, and the HOA president using her position to benefit her personal property. I told her I wanted to wait. I wanted the physical evidence to be complete before we filed anything. She said, "You want them standing in it when it goes wrong?" I said, "Something like that." She told me she would draft the complaint and hold it. I told her I would let her know when to pull the trigger. That afternoon, I drove to the pump station Harold had built on the north end of the property, past the tree line, 800 m upstream from the lake itself. The building was small, cinder block, painted green to match the surrounding vegetation, and it had been maintained with Harold's characteristic precision-oiled hinges, clean gauges, no rust on the manual valve housing. Control valve CV03 was a large diameter hand-operated gate valve, the kind used throughout the state for private water impoundments. I opened the access panel, checked the valve position, confirmed the intake meter was reading normal, and recorded all of it in the maintenance log I had inherited along with the rest of the property. I wrote down the date, the readings, and the observation that all systems were functioning within normal parameters. Then I closed the panel and drove home. That was all, just a routine inspection, properly documented. The permit required annual checks. I was simply doing what the permit required. Before I left, I looked at my phone. The Marina's grand opening was scheduled for June the 15th, at 9 in the morning. Judith had sent a community-wide invitation, complete with a jazz band, champagne, and a note that the local newspaper had confirmed press attendance. I looked at the valve. I looked back at the calendar. In the maintenance log, I made one additional entry 2 lines below the inspection record written, in the same matter-of-fact engineering shorthand I used for every notation. Scheduled maintenance Friday, June 14th. Reduce intake flow to approximately 30% for 36 to 48 hours to assess underflow drainage capacity. Standard procedure per WR 1,987,044 section 7.3. It was in every technical and legal sense exactly what it claimed to be. The permit authorized it. The procedure was codified. No additional notification was required. I closed the lock, tucked it under my arm, and walked back to the truck. The woods were quiet, except for the sound of water moving steadily toward the lake. While I drove home, Judith was meeting with an event planner to finalize the catering order for the opening. 200 glasses of champagne, a tent, white tablecloths, and reserved dock space for each of the 14 boat owners who had contributed to the Marina Fund. She had also taken delivery 3 days earlier of a new 42 FT vessel, $180,000, white hull, brass fittings, her name stenkled on the stern in a tasteful serif font. She had paid extra for early delivery, so it would be in the water by opening day. She had not consulted anyone about the lake's depth, had not reviewed the hydrographic survey, and had not once asked who held the intake permit for the water she was planning to float her investment in. She was the president in her understanding of how the world worked. Presidents did not need to know those things. I looked out my windshield at the road ahead and thought about how confidence without knowledge is just noise with good posture. Patricia called that evening. Everything's ready, she said. I told her to hold for filing until Monday the 17th, 2 days after the event. You're certain you don't want to stop them beforehand? She asked. The evidence is better when it's visible, I said. There was a pause on the line. You're right, she said. Monday the 17th, 3 weeks before the opening, Judith retained a legitimate outside firm, Harwell and Bigham, an actual civil litigation practice, not her husband's vanity letterhead, and filed for a declaratory judgment in the county court. The argument was built around the legal doctrine of implied dedication. Harold Parker had allowed the community to fish along the shore and walk the perimeter for decades, and that long-standing permissive use had, in their interpretation, ripened into a form of public right. They were asking a judge to declare that the northeast shoreline belonged, in practical terms, to the community, regardless of what the deed said. It was not a frivolous argument. Implied dedication has genuine standing in Tennessee case law, but it had one critical structural flaw that the attorneys either missed or chose to overlook. Harold had never surrendered operational control of the water itself. Allowing someone to fish at the edge of your property is not the same thing as granting them the right to pour concrete into your lake bed. Patricia called me after reading the filing. They've just handed us their entire strategy, she said, and it doesn't cover half of what they've actually done. I told her to make sure every one of those gaps was documented in our response. Judith opened a second front the same week, this one on the community platform. Without using my name, she posted a message warning that an unnamed individual was threatening legal action against neighbors who had invested in the Marina project, framing it as an attack on the community rather than a defense of property rights. The post spread quickly within the neighborhood. People who had never spoken harshly to me began crossing the street before I reached them. A group of kids who used to wave from the driveway next door stopped doing it. One morning, I found the rear tire of my truck deflated. No visible damage, no note. Nothing that could be proven. At the supermarket 2 days later, Judith appeared in the same aisle with 2 neighbors flanking her, and she spoke loudly enough to ensure I could hear every word. Greg, your grandfather built something this community treasured for 60 years. Do you really think he would want this? The mention of Harold was precise. It was designed to land in a specific place, and it did. I put down the basket I was carrying, looked at her directly, and said, my grandfather left me a foreign binder, not as decoration. Then I picked the basket back up and walked to the register. She went further. The following week, a formal written complaint was submitted by Judith on HOA letterhead to Director Mills, my supervisor at the State Water Resources Division, alleging that I was using confidential state data in a private property dispute. This was the most dangerous move she had made, because a finding of professional misconduct could follow me for years. Director Mills called me into his office, closed the door, and asked me to walk him through it. I laid out every document I had used: the public hydrographic survey, the permit on file in the state database, the county deed. I placed a printed screenshot of the TDEC public portal on his desk, with the direct URL to each document highlighted. Every single piece of information was available to anyone with internet access and a search bar. "Would you like me to draft a reply to her complaint?" Director Mills asked. Reading the URLs, I said, "If you're going to reply, I'd suggest attaching those links." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I understand the situation," he said. He closed the file. I thanked him and went back to work. 8 days before the opening, the email arrived. It came from Judith's official HOA president account, timestamped at 11:14 in the evening. The message was brief and direct, in a way that her earlier communications, padded with legal-sounding language, had not been. She told me that if I did not withdraw the complaint and sign a non-interference agreement within 48 hours, she would make my life in Pinewood Heights impossible. She had the people and the influence to do it, she wrote, and she intended to use them. I read it once, then again. It was in legal terms a written threat, transmitted through an official channel bearing her title and a timestamp. I printed it, scanned it, and forwarded it to Patricia with a single line in the body of the email. "New evidence adding to file." Then I typed a reply to Judith consisting of one sentence. "I have received your email, thank you." I hit send and turned off the monitor. The folder on my desktop now held 47 items. 47 pieces of documentation, organized chronologically, labeled precisely, each one representing a choice she had made and I had recorded. That night, I sat for a while at Harold's old desk in the dark, with the folder on the screen and the lake visible through the window, faint and flat, and silver under the half-moon. I thought about the last afternoon I had spent with him at the shoreline the summer before he declined, when he told me that the land wasn't something you argued over, it was something you kept. He didn't mean it as sentiment. He meant it as instruction. I looked at the 47 files and thought, yes, sir. I drove to the pump station 2 days later to do a final pre-maintenance inspection. I called Patricia when I got back. "I'll be performing the scheduled intake reduction this Friday," I told her. "I'll be at the office Saturday morning," she said. "I know," I said. "I'll be up early too." Wait. She sent that threat from her official HOA president email account. The account that has her title, her name, and a timestamp on every outgoing message. She just built the prosecution's exhibit list for them. And Greg printed it, scanned it, added it to the folder, and replied with one sentence. 1. "I am not breathing right now." Every single escalation she threw at him. The fake fines, the husband's letter, the complaint to his boss, and now a written threat from an official address. He caught every single one and put it in a folder. The valve hasn't moved yet. The opening is in 8 days. Like this video right now if your hands are shaking. And do not close this tab. The next chapter is the one you've been waiting for. Friday, June the 14th, 6:00 in the morning. I dressed in field clothes, worn canvas pants, work boots, a long-sleeved shirt, not the collared shirt, and slacks I wore to the office. I drank coffee at the kitchen table while the neighborhood was still quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists before 6:30 on a summer morning, when the birds are louder than the traffic and the light comes in flat and gold through the window screens. I reviewed the maintenance log one final time, confirmed the scheduled entry was dated and signed, then sent a brief notification email to Sarah Yun at TD Deck at 6:14. Routine maintenance on Lake Callaway intake system. Reduction to approximately 30% flow for 36 to 48 hours to assess underflow drainage per permit. WR 1987044 section 7.3, full restoration expected within 72 hours. I attached the permit clause, I hit send. Then I picked up my field bag, added the calibrated flow meter and the maintenance log, and walked out to the truck. The drive to the pump station took 11 minutes. The access road was unpaved, shaded by oak and sweetgum trees that Harold had never cleared because he believed in the root systems they sent down toward the water table. The station itself sat in a small clearing cinder block green paint, a corrugated metal roof that pinged softly when the morning temperature started to rise. There was no one else within half a mile. There was no reason for anyone else to be there. I unlocked the access panel and ran through the procedure the same way I always run through a procedure. Methodical, unhurried, every step verified before moving to the next. Step 1. I read the upstream flow meter and logged the baseline 14. 3 cubic feet per second within normal seasonal range. Step 2. I measured the current lake level with a handheld gauge, 2.34 m, well within operating parameters. Step 3. I opened the control housing for valve CV03. The valve was a large gate-style mechanism, the kind installed in rural water management infrastructure throughout the Mid-South during the 1970s and 80s. Robust, simple, and entirely reliable when maintained. Harold had greased it every spring without fail. It moved smoothly. Step 4. I rotated the valve from full open to 30% open, a reduction of 70% in intake flow. Step 5. I waited 4 minutes and took a downstream flow reading, 4.1 cubic feet per second, confirming the adjustment had registered correctly. Step 6. I photographed the valve position, the gauge reading, and the timestamp on my field meter. Step 7. I recorded everything in the maintenance log intake, reduced per scheduled procedure. All readings within expected range. No anomalies observed. 7 steps. About 22 minutes total. I closed the housing, relocked the panel, and stood in the clearing for a moment, listening to the sound of the reduced flow, moving through the intake channel quieter now, more like a stream than a rush. From a purely hydrological standpoint, what would follow was straightforward, with inflow at 30% of normal, and with the natural losses from evaporation and subsurface seepage that any open water body experiences in a Tennessee June. The lake level would drop between 0.6 and 0.9 m over the next 24 to 36 hours. The Marina's structural design had specified a minimum operating depth of 1.88 m for vessels in the larger displacement class. With the reduction, actual depth in the docking area would settle somewhere between 1.0 and 1.2 m, roughly the depth of a bathtub and roughly 60 cm short of what a 42 ft yacht required to do anything other than sit. That evening 12 mi away, Judith was hosting a preview dinner for 30 of the Marina's most invested supporters. Catered food, imported wine, a projected slideshow cycling through the architect's final renderings. In the private board chat, messages moved quickly. Boats are trailered to the launch ramp. The press confirmed. The jazz band confirmed. Dock assignments finalized. Judith sent a message to the full group at 9:47. Tomorrow we show Pinewood Heights what leadership looks like. I know this because it was later entered into evidence. I was not online at 9:47. I had eaten dinner, washed the dishes, read for an hour and a half, and turned off the light at 10:00. I set the alarm for 6:30. There was nothing left to prepare. Everything that needed to happen was already happening quietly in the dark, governed entirely by physics. The lake was drawing down by centime, an inch an hour in the warm June air, and it did not need me to watch it. It simply needed time, which Harold had always said was the most underestimated resource a patient person had. At 2 in the morning, with a crescent moon overhead and no wind at all, the lake surface had already dropped 4/10 of a meter from the afternoon baseline. Along the northeast shoreline, where the lake bed sloped up toward the newly installed dock platform, the bottom sediment, that particular black silt that collects undisturbed for decades, was beginning to emerge. The 14 concrete pilings stood in it like fence posts. The boats tied to them shifted almost imperceptibly as the buoyancy beneath their holes thinned. It was a slow process and a quiet one, and it was entirely, irrevocably underway. In the maintenance log, the only record of any of it was a single line in my handwriting written the previous afternoon. Routine procedure, all readings normal. By 7:30 Saturday morning, I had been sitting on the folding chair on the west-facing slope above the lake for nearly an hour. A thermos of coffee on the small table beside me and Harold's binder on top of that, not because I needed it, but because it felt right to have it there. The view from the slope took in the entire northeast quadrant of the shoreline. What I saw where the marina should have been was not a marina. It was a basin of dark, exposed sediment, steaming faintly in the early June warmth, the way only uncovered lake bottom steams. That particular mixture of algae, decomposed organic matter, and oxygen-starved silt, producing a smell that was low and mineral and unmistakably, undeniably, the smell of something that was not supposed to be seen. The surface that should have been water was perfectly flat in the way only mud is flat. There was no glitter, no movement, nothing that caught the light. 14 boats rested in it at various angles, their moorings still attached to the new concrete pilings, their hulls pressed against the bottom, some tilting 5 degrees, some tilting more. Judith's 42-footer, the $180,000 vessel, delivered 4 days before the opening, so it would be first in the water, had settled at roughly 15 degrees to starboard. Its bow was pressed into the silt. Its stern was elevated, the running lights on the transom pointing upward at an angle that made it look like it was trying to signal passing aircraft. The sound coming from the Marina area at that distance was the sound of taut mooring lines under lateral stress, of fiberglass hulls flexing against an uneven surface, and of a thin layer of residual water draining in slow drops from the dock, planking into the mud below, a sound like a clock ticking down to nothing. Guests began arriving at 8:45. They came dressed the way people dress for an event they expect to be photographed at. Blazers, summer dresses, boat shoes, and pale canvas, a few wide-brimmed hats. The Harwell Gazette photographer Tom Briggs arrived first and stood at the entrance to the Marina access path for almost a full minute before he raised his camera. He was not photographing the dock. He was photographing the boats in the mud. He shot methodically, the way experienced press photographers shoot, when they understand they are looking at the story rather than just illustrating it. Judith arrived at 8:55 in a cream-colored dress, her hair done, a bottle of champagne in her left hand. She came around the corner of the access path, saw the shoreline, and stopped walking. The champagne bottle left her hand in a slow, unintentional arc and landed on the grass without breaking, rolling sideways into the wet turf and fizzing quietly against the blades. The sound it made was the loudest thing in the sudden silence. "What is this?" It was not a question. Her voice had lost whatever it had been constructed to do. She walked forward, and her heels went into the mud on the first step with a sound like a cork pulled from a bottle, that deep, wet sealing sound. And then the shoes stopped moving and her feet kept going, and she was standing in the mud in her stockings without fully having decided to be there. She waded to the edge of the dock platform and looked at the 42 FT hull tilting in the silt. "That is my boat," she said this time to no one in particular, and her voice carried a quality I had not heard from her before, the specific note of a person encountering a reality they had genuinely not modeled as possible. Dave Carver arrived 30 seconds behind her and stopped at the mudline. He looked at the boats. He looked at the sky as though the water might be up there. He said quietly and with what I recognized as the beginning of genuine alarm, "Judith, who owns this lake?" She said the HOA manages this community. The HOA. And he said more carefully, "Not the community, the lake." "Who owns the water?" She did not answer. She looked up the slope to where I was sitting with my coffee. I did not wave. The next 40 minutes were a cascade of phone calls, most of which I pieced together later from statements and records. Several board members called Harmon and Sons. No one answered on a Saturday. One resident called the county fire department to ask about pumping water into the lake from an external source. The dispatcher explained that emergency pumping services were reserved for emergencies involving structures, not recreational water features. Tom Briggs moved methodically along the bank, shooting every angle, including one photograph of Judith, standing ankle-deep in silt with her shoes somewhere behind her and her dress, hemline dark with mud at the bottom, and one photograph of me sitting on the folding chair on the hill with the coffee thermos in the binder. That photograph ran on the front page of the Harwell Gazette the following Wednesday. When he eventually climbed the slope to where I was sitting and asked for a comment, I put the cup down and told him, "I performed routine intake maintenance yesterday morning per the terms of my water rights permit, as I notified TDC by email before beginning the work. Complete documentation is available through the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation." Tom wrote it down, word for word. He recognized correctly that there was nothing to add. Marcus appeared on the bank below me at some point during all of it. He stood there looking at the boats, then looked up at me on the hill, and we made eye contact for about 3 seconds before he looked away. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say that the lake hadn't already said more clearly than either of us could have managed. A cream dress black mud, a $180,000 boat pointing its stern at the sky, and Greg Parker sitting on a folding chair on a hill with a coffee thermos, having gone to bed at 10:00 the night before like a man with a clear conscience. He didn't sabotage anything. He maintained his own property, filed the correct notification at 6:00 in the morning, documented every step, and let physics do the rest. Judith walked into the mud herself, literally. The story is not over. There are criminal charges, a courtroom, and a front-page newspaper story still ahead. Subscribe right now and stay with me. Chapter 7 is where the law catches up. Monday morning, 9:00, Patricia Owe walked into the Harwell County Courthouse with a 3-ring binder containing 47 exhibits and filed a civil complaint against Judith M. Carver, David Carver, the Pinewood Heights HOA, and Harmon and Sons Construction. The 4 counts were enumerated with the kind of structural clarity that comes from having prepared the argument for 6 weeks before pulling the trigger. Unauthorized construction within a state-designated buffer zone in violation of Tennessee Code Section 600 and 93,108. Trespass on private land without a recorded easement. Written threats transmitted through an official channel by a person acting in a fiduciary capacity and breach of fiduciary duty by an HOA officer who directed association funds and authority toward a project that directly benefited her personal property. Every count had its own exhibit stack. Every exhibit had a timestamp. The filing clerk stamped the cover page at 912, and by 9:45 the docket number was visible in the online court record. Tech moved the same day. The stop work order covering all Marina construction and modification activities arrived at the HOA's registered address, by certified mail and by hand delivery, simultaneously standard procedure, when a violation involves a protected buffer zone and active construction. The order cited investigation number TDEC-VIO 240-891, which had been open since the morning I submitted my first documentation package to Sarah Yun 6 weeks earlier. The order required immediate cessation of all construction, preservation of the site in its current condition, and submission of a remediation plan within 30 days. 2 TDEC field engineers arrived Tuesday to conduct measurements and collect soil cores from the base of the piling sites. Their findings, formalized in a report issued 10 days later, confirmed that 12 of the 14 concrete pilings had been driven through the protected subsurface filtration layer, that the buffer zone was designed to preserve the same layer that filtered runoff before it reached the lake, and that could not be restored simply by removing the concrete. The per-day administrative fine for each day of confirmed violation, calculated from the date the first piling was poured, came to $10,000. Sarah Yun told the press only that the agency had received a complete and well-documented report from the property owner, and that all subsequent steps would follow standard procedure. She did not say my name, but she did not need to. The emergency HOA board meeting on Tuesday evening was not called by Judith. It was called by 6 of the 9 remaining board members, 2 of whom had already retained personal legal counsel. Greg Parker, property owner and named complainant in an active civil suit, was invited to attend as an interested party. I came, sat down at the end of the table, and placed the binder on the surface in front of me. I did not open it. Judith arrived last and began the meeting by characterizing the TDC order as a procedural complication that the association's legal team would resolve quickly. Board member Karen Tills, who had been quietly reviewing documents for several days, interrupted her before she finished the sentence. "We never had an easement," Karen said. "We never filed for a construction permit in the buffer zone. We never obtained consent from the property owner. I've read every document in Mr. Parker's complaint, and there is not a single filing in this stack that shouldn't have been done before we broke ground." The room was quiet in the way. Rooms are quiet when everyone has known something for a while and is waiting for someone to say it aloud. Another member asked who had reviewed the legal exposure before the project was approved. Dave Carver, present as a guest of his wife, did not look at the table, the wall, or any person in the room. A third member asked whose signature was on the contract with Harmon and Sons. The vote at the end of the meeting was 7-2. Judith Carver's presidency was suspended pending the outcome of the civil and regulatory proceedings. The criminal referral came from the county prosecutor's office 2 weeks after that, based primarily on the email Judith had sent from her official account 8 days before the opening. The one telling me my life in Pinewood Heights would be made impossible if I didn't comply within 48 hours. Under Tennessee Code Section 3,917,308, communicating a credible threat through electronic means constitutes criminal. Threatening, a Class A misdemeanor carrying up to 11 months and 29 days of incarceration, and a fine of up to $2,500. The construction trespass, directing workers onto private land without a recorded legal right, added a Class B misdemeanor. Count, Harmon and Sons, separately was assessed a $47,000 administrative penalty for proceeding with construction in a protected zone without the appropriate permits, a finding that also triggered a referral to the Tennessee Contractor Licensing Board. Dave Carver received a formal inquiry from the Tennessee Bar Association concerning the conflict of interest embedded in his having provided HOA legal guidance on a project in which his household held a direct financial stake. When Judith walked out of the arraignment, Dave was beside her and Tom Briggs was on the steps. The photograph Tom took that morning was quieter than the Marina photograph. No mud, no tilting boats, but the expression on Judith's face carried more information than the entire Marina project combined. The Harwell Gazette ran the story under the headline, HOA. President faces criminal charges following private lake dispute engineer. Prevails through documentation, not confrontation. I read it at the kitchen table. I did not share it anywhere. I called Patricia and thanked her. She said the credit belonged to the 47 exhibits. I said that the 47 exhibits belonged to Harold. 3 weeks after the intake reduction, I drove back to the pump station in the same field close with the same maintenance log and rotated valve CV03 back to full open. Logged the action, photographed the gauge, noted the time, 6:41 in the morning, the birds going at full volume in the trees around the station. Exactly as I had told Tech in the original notification, the lake was back to normal operating level within 72 hours. I stood at the shore on the morning the water returned to its full mark and watched it settle, the surface spreading back across the exposed mud until the silt disappeared and the old familiar water line reappeared. Against the stones Harold had placed along the bank in the 1970s, gray and worn smooth by decades of lapping, the wood ducks that nested in the big red maple at the northeast corner. They had been here since before I was born, and they came back the first morning, as though they had simply been waiting a reasonable distance away. The frogs resumed their conversation from the cattail beds. The smell of the returning water was clean and cold and familiar. The smell of something that had always belonged here, finding its way back. The court order requiring Marina removal arrived the following month. HOA Pinewood Heights was directed to engage a licensed contractor for full piling extraction and shoreline restoration with all work subject to TD deck oversight and completion within 90 days. The final invoice, submitted by the remediation contractor, came to $340,000, nearly 3 times the original Marina budget. The association drew down its reserve fund and raised member dues to cover it, neither of which required a vote from Judith, since she was no longer presiding over anything. The 14 boat owners, whose vessels had been hauled off the mud by commercial crane, a service they paid for individually, dealt quietly with hull repairs and kept their feelings to themselves, which I understood. They had been sold a vision and had bought it in good faith, and the person who had sold it to them was now answering to a judge, Corinne Tills, installed as interim president by the reconstituted board, knocked on my door on a Saturday afternoon in late July. She stood on the porch and said without preamble, "The community owes you an apology. I'm here to give the one I can speak for." I told her I didn't need the apology as much as I needed it to not happen to the next person who ever held private land adjacent to a common interest community and had less documentation than I did. She nodded and said she understood. Before she left, she asked if I would be willing to meet with the new board to review the association's governing documents. I said I would think about it. I did, and eventually I agreed. Marcus came by on a weeknight, about a month after the arraignment, standing at the door with the particular posture of a man who has been rehearsing an awkward conversation. I let him in, put on coffee, and let him get to it at his own pace. What he said was, I didn't ask any questions. I just took her word for it and pressured you, and that was wrong. I told him what I believed, which was that he hadn't been wrong to want peace. He had just been working with incomplete information, and Judith had understood exactly how to keep it incomplete. Did you ever actually get angry? He asked me after a long pause. I thought about it honestly. I told him that yes, I had, particularly the night the email arrived, sitting in the dark at Harold's desk, thinking about what it meant that someone felt entitled to threaten the thing my grandfather had built intended for 60 years. But anger without documentation, I told him, is just noise, and noise was not what the situation needed. We sat with our coffee and looked at the lake through the window, and it was the quietest the whole story had ever been. In September, I found the letter again, Harold's handwritten note from the safe, the one that ended with the line about knowing when to use the binder. I read it properly this time, all the way through, and I understood things in it that I hadn't understood in March, when grief was still louder than meaning. Harold wrote that over 60 years, various people had approached him about the lake: developers, municipal planners, a homeowners association in its early days, neighbors who wanted to buy it, neighbors who wanted to share it, neighbors who wanted to simply absorb it by use until the ownership became a technicality. He had refused all of them, and he wrote that he had refused not out of stubbornness, but out of a belief that some things needed a guardian more than they needed a developer. He wanted me to be the guardian, not the fighter. The guardian. In October, I executed a conservation easement with the Tennessee Land Trust, a legal instrument that placed permanent restrictions on the use of Lake Callaway and its shoreline restrictions that would run with the land regardless of who held the deed. Binding on all future owners, enforceable in perpetuity under state and federal law. No commercial structures, no permanent docking infrastructure without written environmental review. The lake protected not from me but from me and from everyone who might come after. I signed the document at the Land Trust office on a Tuesday afternoon. The attorney across the table asked if I wanted to say anything for the record. I said, "My grandfather built this in 1958. I'm just making sure it's here in 208. I drove home, parked in the driveway, and walked down to the W's edge. The surface was still. The light on it was gold. Somewhere in the cattles, a frog was making itself heard. The story of Lake Callaway is not a story about a man who beat an enemy. It is a story about what happens when patient preparation meets unchecked arrogance, and why the outcome was never really in doubt once the documentation was complete. The first lesson is that knowledge is a form of power that cannot be confiscated. Judith Carver had the votes, the money, the social leverage, and a lawyer in her own house. Greg Parker had a foreign binder and 15 years of professional training. At every single confrontation point in this story, the binder outweighed everything else she brought to the table, because knowledge converts directly into evidence, and evidence is what courts, regulatory agencies, and honest people respond to. The second lesson is that silence is not submission. Every time Greg declined to argue publicly, to post to react, or to escalate in kind, Judith interpreted it as weakness and said something else. And every additional thing she said went into the folder. Arrogance is a self-documenting condition. It records itself if you give it enough time and enough silence to work with. The third lesson is that operating within the law is not a constraint. It is a multiplier. Greg never touched anything he didn't own, never threatened anyone, never misrepresented anything to any authority. Every action he took was pre-authorized, documented before it happened, and verifiable by any independent party. That perfect procedural cleanliness is precisely what made it impossible to attack him. You cannot sue a man for doing exactly what his permit says he is allowed to do. The fourth lesson belongs to Harold. He did not leave Greg a weapon. He left Greg a framework, a set of tools for understanding what the land was, what rights attached to it, and what responsibilities came with holding it. The conservation easement Greg signed in October was the completion of that framework. The lake will outlast all of us who argued about it, and it will do so because one man understood that some things deserve protection more than they deserve profit. Patience is not passive. It is the longest form of preparation.